Welcome to the FieldLink podcast, brought to you by Helena. I'm your host, Bill Smith. In this episode, we visit with national agronomist Derek Emerine as he unveils crop nutritional deficiency trends that have been gathered from multiple crops from across the nation with the Extractor tissue sampling program. Plus, Jody Lawrence will join us from Nashville for a commodity commentary update. And finally, Justin Mack, Helena Product Manager from North Dakota, will join us for a wheat-wise update from the Northern Plains. Stay tuned for this episode of FieldLink. And welcome to FieldLink. I'm your host, Bill Smith. And joining us today on this episode is Derek Emerine. Derek is the national agronomist for Helena, based in Memphis, Tennessee. And Derek, welcome to FieldLink.
Thanks, Bill. Glad to be here.
Derek, it's great to have you here in the audience today, in the studio rather. And what we want to talk a little bit about is some of the research you and your team have been working on really for over 20 years with the Agri-Intelligence team and the agronomy team coming together. But today we're going to focus on the last 3 years. We've had a wide range of environmental conditions, lots of different things happening, whether you're on the West Coast or the East Coast, in the middle of America, down in the South, we've had a lot of different environmental challenges. And one of the unique things, one of the tools that's very important in Agri-Intelligence is Extractor. And with Extractor, you have the ability to pull tissue samples and analyze this information. And today we're going to focus on the last 3 years of data that you and your team have collected.
That's right.
So tell us a little bit about that process. How does that work? And what are we going to look at today?
Sure. So with Extractor, we can go out. We're going to pull some directed plant tissue test. We have the ability to georeference these if we want and correlate them back to soil test or yield monitor data. But the key here is to go out and pull these samples at key times when we know crops are going to be uptaking nutrients, or when we want to try to time an application if we have a fungicide ride or something like that, and get a better idea of what's deficient. That's been real important the last couple of years with high fertilizer prices. There's been a lot of people that have cut their commodity-based fertilizers in the spring or the fall. Mm-hmm. And so, it's important to get a pulse of what is actually getting into the plant. And an Extractor allows us to do that.
Well, certainly you've got a lot of people that are boots on the ground collecting this information. Again, this data that we're referencing today come across the entire United States. Is that correct? That's correct.
We're looking at data from all across the U.S. To me, it's actually more valuable to look at it. You always hear the story, well, I'm from Alabama and I have different conditions than what I have in Iowa. And that's all true.
Right.
Cannot disagree with that. But when you start looking at very large data sets, you can start to see trends that are showing up whether you're in Alabama or Iowa or wherever you might be.
Sure.
And if the data from a large data set is saying that, X nutrient is a problem, it's probably something we need to pay attention to. Now, it may be more or less of a problem in certain geographies, but we can identify what we need to focus on overall.
Yeah, and I think based on the information that we have in front of us today, that's really the theme. We're taking a look at all this big data collected from all over, and it's really, quite frankly, building a story out and giving us some pretty key indicators on what we might want to be looking at as we get ready for Plant 23.
Absolutely.
So let's dive right in, Derek. Let's talk a little bit about corn today. We're going to focus on 4 crops here on this episode, but I know you have the ability and you have collected data from a wide range of crops. Is that right?
That is correct. From watermelons to blueberries to asparagus to onions to corn, cotton, rice, soybeans. It's all over the board.
It's a wide range, and that's what's exciting about the Agri-Intelligence program and the Extractor piece of that. So let's focus back on corn. You've had over 50,000 samples over the last 3 years that you're really taking a look at.
Yeah, several things showed up here that people typically don't think about. When we look at, there's a lot of growth stages in corn, and when we look holistically at corn in general, whether it's early season at V3 or late season all the way at R1 or whatever, across all growth stages, we typically see potassium, nitrogen, phosphorus in that order, and magnesium as kind of the most deficient nutrient showing up. And that whole NPK thing is not a shock to anybody. They are macronutrients for a reason. I think it's important to understand that, when you look at the order, it's actually, in our deficiency order, it's actually potassium, nitrogen, then phosphorus.
Okay.
So, nitrogen's very important, but when we look at what's showing up in the plant, K is actually showing up more deficient than nitrogen. The outlier here that may be a surprise to some is magnesium. Typically, agronomically, you think about magnesium deficiency showing up in sandy soils. And we see that when we go into the Carolinas and Georgia, where we have some corn. Magnesium has historically been a problem there. You go into parts of West Tennessee or North Alabama, magnesium has historically been a problem. What this data is telling us, which is a little bit different, is we're seeing magnesium show up all across the Corn Belt as well.
Wow.
And a lot of our agronomists in the Northern Business Unit have been seeing this anecdotally for the last several years, and our data backs it up, that it is showing up and something that we may need to take a look at.
So what kind of ranges are we looking at? I mean, of all the tests that you've taken, magnesium you referenced, how short is it?
Well, what we see, of that about 50,000 samples, depending on the growth stage, we're anywhere from 40 to 45% of our samples by growth stage are deficient in magnesium, which is a pretty sizable number.
Yeah, especially from that wide range that you referenced across the U.S. That's a pretty good indicator that 40%, 45% of the samples could have a deficiency in this. Let's talk a little bit about magnesium. What's its main role?
So, it's a central component of chlorophyll. So it's going to be very important for creating carbohydrates and sugars. We got to have chlorophyll to do photosynthesis. So it plays some other roles, but the biggest role is it's a central component of chlorophyll.
So it's certainly an area we don't want to be deficient in.
No.
Very critical for producing yield, because
that's right.
That's what we're all about.
Exactly.
Yeah. What else did we learn on the corn side of
things?
Well,
the other thing I like to look at is, I'm not going to get into the weeds too much, but I think it behooves us to pay attention of what deficiencies are showing up at the early season versus the mid-season versus late season.
Right.
And really prioritize when certain things are showing up. So it's probably no surprise to anybody when we look at early season, prior to V4 corn.
Yep.
The top two biggest issues are phosphorus and magnesium. And everybody knows you have a cool, wet soil. It's going to inhibit phosphorus uptake. Everybody knows that. It's no surprise at all.
Sure.
The data backs it up. But magnesium was number two.
Wow.
during that early season as well. So it's something to think about. You move on to that mid-season, which is a broad range.
Sure.
And depending on what part of the country we're at and how we collect samples and what growth stages we collect. But that mid-season is a pretty wide range. It's anywhere from V4 all the way up to reproduction, which is a big change there. In that time of year, it's NPK.
Right.
But also magnesium.
Magnesium
is number 4.
Yeah.
And so, this could be an indicator depending on where you're at. You always need to collect your own data.
Sure.
But it could be an indicator that we need to modify our fall or spring commodity fertilizer. Maybe you need to put a little less N or P and more K, or vice versa.
Sure.
It can give you a little bit of a roadmap of maybe where we're falling short mid-season. And then lastly, at reproductive stages, it kind of changes. Potassium and sulfur end up being the top two.
Okay.
But nitrogen and magnesium are still there, and still over 40% of the samples are coming back deficient in magnesium. The surprise here, or just something to be aware of, is sulfur. We've talked about sulfur a lot within Helena the last several years. We're not getting near as much sulfur from the rain. A lot of people know they need sulfur, but we're finding that some may not be applying enough, and that is just something to be aware of.
And a lot of that's driven, back in the 60s and 70s, we had all those coal burning,
Right.
factories and facilities that gave us free sulfur.
Exactly right.
And now we've cleaned the environment up, and
Exactly.
we need more sulfur.
We
for
need
the
more.
crops.
And we're making higher yields. So,
Sure.
for a lot of years, if you had 15 or 20 pounds of sulfur applied, that was more than enough. But if you're making 250 bushel or more corn,
Right.
you probably need closer to 30 or 35 pounds of sulfur. And what the data is telling us is as we get late in the season, during that reproductive time frame, sulfur starts to rear its head.
Right.
And so I think there's a lot of people that may want to think about upping that sulfur a little bit, and it's just something to think about.
Well, I think what's really great about this data that you're sharing with us today on the FieldLink podcast is this is a summary. This is a great roadmap of, hey, be prepared to look out for this. That doesn't say you shouldn't do your own extractor samples.
Exactly.
You need to do that.
Yeah, you have. This is just key information that we've seen that could be a problem. It may not be a problem on your farm. If you're putting out 35 or 40 pounds of sulfur and you're making 270 bushel corn, sulfur is probably not your issue.
Sure.
But it's just something to be aware of.
Yeah.
The last one I'll say, which was a little bit surprising as well, is zinc deficiency.
Right.
And historically, everybody knows zinc is important for corn.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people put zinc in if they run a starter. They're running it with their pre-plant fertilizer, which is great. Continue to do that.
Right.
But there's another big uptake of zinc once we hit reproduction. And sometimes we're seeing some later season zinc deficiency show up. So it's just something to be aware of. It's
Right.
not a big deal, but if you're trying to push your yields to that next level,
Right.
that may be something to pay attention to.
And based on some of the data that you'd shared, I mean, zinc is hungry at that V7 stage, and then it kind of flattens out, but then it says, hey, reproductive time, I need more zinc.
Exactly.
And tell us a little bit, our listeners, what's the powerful role of zinc in a corn crop?
Zinc it plays a lot of roles with enzymatic functions and just some of the development of the kernel and everything else. Sure. It is a micronutrient.
Right.
So we don't need a lot of zinc.
Yep.
But to your point, there is a bigger uptake once we hit that reproduction and we're developing those kernels. And so it's not a big deal. It's not a wholesale drastic change, but it's just something to pay attention to.
Right, certainly. Great insight, great information on corn. Let's transition, Derek, to soybeans. You had well over 30,000 plus samples across the nation in the last few years here. Let's talk about some of the deficiencies that you learned there.
Sure. So you look at soybeans in general. The biggest two players are potassium and sulfur, and that's across all growth stages. I'm probably going to harp a little bit on sulfur again on soybeans. Overall, it's the number 2 most efficient nutrient, but when we go to early season soybeans and R1 soybeans, it's the number 1 most efficient nutrient.
Okay.
And so, a lot of times soybeans can be seen as kind of the stepchild.
Right.
Hey, I'm going to fertilize my corn,
Right.
but my soybeans, that's my rotational crop. I'm not that worried about it. And so a lot of times there may not be a lot of attention paid to soybeans. But with the price of soybeans
Sure.
and the market, there is an opportunity.
The demand, absolutely.
There's a lot of opportunity there. What we see with sulfur, we're not getting it from the rain. And a lot of people have a hard time sometimes thinking about sulfur because they're not applying nitrogen. Mm-hmm. Typically we're going to get sulfur with ammonium sulfate or our amthio with our UAN application. We're not typically applying nitrogen to soybeans. So sometimes it's like, well, I'm not going to worry about sulfur. But our data continues to show that some sort of sulfur fertilizer probably makes sense for a soybean program.
Okay.
The plants are telling on us, and it's showing up, pretty big early season and at R1.
Yeah, that's definitely a fix that the Helena representative can certainly work through.
Absolutely. There's a lot of different ways to look at it. There's not one solution that fits everybody. Some guys will go out with a little bit of dry AMS or pelletized gypsum or whatever the case, with their commodity program, which is a great fit. Some guys hit it that way and with a foliar shot with a fungicide.
Sure.
There's not one solution there, but it is something to pay attention to.
The good news there is we've got a lot of tools in the toolbox.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's move on to the reproductive stage for soybeans. What are
Sure.
you learning there?
So, you get to that R2, R3, right around that fungicide timing. The top 3 deficiencies are potassium, nitrogen, and sulfur.
Okay.
So to that point, there's a lot of opportunities there. I'm not saying that you need all 3, but that's a prime time. Prior to that fungicide, pull an extractor sample. See where you're at with your crop.
Right.
You may be sufficient in all of them. You may be deficient in all of them. You may be deficient in one of them. But that is a really good time to look and see what is limited in my soybean crop.
Boy, that's a really good point for soybean growers that are planning on a fungicide application. Let's take a little time there and pull that extractor sample to see, I guess, what the health report card says.
Exactly.
And by gosh, if we need to make an amendment, if we need to add a different product along with that ride, boy, what an opportunity to take advantage of that extra trip. Yeah,
for sure.
Okay, so micronutrients. Talk to me there.
I really harped on zinc on the corn. What's interesting with soybeans, zinc is really not showing up as that big of a player in soybeans.
Okay.
Boron and manganese tend to be a little bit more predominant in soybeans. So, and sometimes neither one of them show up, but it's just something to kind of be aware of. Our data continues to show that zinc has not seemed to be a big player in soybeans.
Okay.
But boron and manganese tend to show up a little bit more.
Okay, and let's talk about the function of boron in this case.
So boron's going to be in seed development during that reproduction time, helping develop, the actual soybean itself. Manganese, manganese tends to show up a lot earlier. You're going to get a bunch of chlorosis in the actual leaf tissue. It helps with a lot of enzymatic issues throughout the plant. I tend to see, depending on if you have a high pH market, probably see manganese a little bit more in certain areas than even boron.
Wow.
And then, manganese has been around for a while. It used to show up when Roundup Ready first came out.
Right.
It would use the manganese in the plant to metabolize the glyphosate, and we would get a yellow flashing.
Yep.
And so, manganese is pretty showy. It's going to show up if you have an issue, but it's not everywhere. It's just something to be aware of.
Right. Well, great insight on soybeans. A lot of good insight there as we get ready to plant our crop for 2023. Derek, let's move on to wheat. How can we become more wheat wise? Taking a look at this sample data here.
We don't have as much data as we do on corn and soybeans, but we have a sizable data set here. I think the big thing, there weren't a lot of surprises. To me, the biggest surprise in wheat was that across all our growth stages, boron showed up as being the most efficient nutrient.
Okay.
The only one that it's not number one is that flag leaf to maturity.
Okay.
But at that stage, it's the number 2 most efficient nutrient.
So it's there. It's a very critical marker.
Right. It is showing up. It's an easy fix. We got all kinds of opportunities. There's a ton of tools in the toolbox and we don't need very much boron.
Right.
But it did show up a lot. After that, it's kind of similar players. One that was missing that people may worry about was phosphorus. Phosphorus didn't really show up in a lot of our data, but potassium, nitrogen, zinc, and magnesium are kind of the biggest players after boron. So to me, that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, that is very interesting. And one more time on boron for wheat, that has to do with what?
It's going to be with the seed production again.
Yeah.
It is showing up early. I don't know, we can always dive into the data. We're seeing it early season as well. I don't know how much of an impact it's having then. But it's a pretty easy application to make. And
I think it's important to connect the dots here when we talk about boron and seed production. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, we're trying to make yield.
We're trying to make yield, make a lot of seeds to, put more bushels in the bin to run across that scale.
Yep. for sure.
So paying attention to products like boron in this case and making sure we're on top of that game is really going to be important.
The last thing I'll say on wheat is just depending on what market you're in, if you have a high pH, soil, wheat is probably our most responsive crop to copper.
Okay.
And so if your geography has high pH or a history of copper deficiency, you want to pay attention to it.
And broadly speaking, what geographies tend to have
So a lot
pHs?
of that, the northwest part of the country runs into copper deficiency.
North Dakota and Idaho and Montana and some of those countries.
Oregon, Washington.
Okay.
You'll see it some in parts of Oklahoma where we have high pH. You could run into it. It's just, it's not everywhere, but it's something to be aware of.
So if you do have those higher pH soils, be paying attention to copper if you're in wheat production.
Absolutely.
Okay, finally, we're going to wrap things up here. Let's move to our next crop and talk about cotton.
Sure, cotton. We have about 23,000 samples over the last 3 years. And we look at all growth stages. This is probably, the first one's not going to be a surprise, but the biggest thing that shows up is potassium.
Okay.
Cotton doesn't remove a lot of potassium from the soil, but it takes up more potassium than just about any other crop. And so our data continues to show that K deficiency is the biggest issue in cotton. One surprising thing that shows up that people typically don't think about, we've seen it for the last 4 or 5 years, is zinc.
Okay.
And when we get to early and mid-bloom cotton, zinc is actually as big or a bigger issue than even potassium, according to this data.
Okay.
So it's showing up a lot. I have a lot of experience with cotton, never really did think of zinc being that big of a player. But as you look at this data, it's showing up. And it does help with branching and boll development.
Okay.
There is a relationship between zinc and boron and boll development. So, I think it's something to be aware of if you're trying to take your cotton yields to that next level.
Right.
It's a pretty drastic number of how many of those samples are showing up as zinc deficient.
Well, and Derek, I think what's really neat about this whole data set, this whole analysis is we're talking 3 years of data.
That's right.
Over a wide range of the country. And more importantly, look back at the calendar. We've had dry years. We've had wet years. We've had late years. We've had early years. So when you lay it all out, I mean, what a wide range of different data sets that you got there to look at.
Going back to cotton too, when you look across all growth stages, I've hit on potassium and zinc, and in the last 3 of the top 5, nitrogen, sulfur, and then calcium. And this is one, nitrogen makes sense. We're used to that. Sulfur, there's a recurring theme of sulfur.
Sure.
We've already hit on it with corn and soybeans. The calcium, I don't, I'm going to be honest, don't have a good answer for today. We're seeing it. It's in that, 15 to 20% of the samples, depending on the growth stage, are coming back deficient. Typically we think of that being in our low pH areas.
Sure.
And, applying your ag lime tends to take care of that. But we have seen some where, the pH is where it needs to be, and we're still seeing a little bit of calcium deficiency.
Okay.
So that's something, we don't have all the answers.
Right.
And this data is kind of leading us down paths of, hey, maybe we need to go to explore some of these other things that we typically haven't thought of as being a problem. And so that's something, we're curious about, and, more will be revealed, but we got to do a little bit of research and see, is there a relationship there?
Man, I think you bring up a really great point in how powerful this data can be when we learn about things like calcium, as you pointed out in cotton. It poked its head up and said, it threw a red flag. And it's like, okay, we don't know what we don't know. Let's go invest some dollars into research and development. That's where the AI team and agronomy team could partner with the Helena Products Group to say, is there a recurring issue here? Is there a solution? Is there a product that we can help, fix this case where we do have calcium shortages for cotton?
Exactly. Exactly.
So that's the power of the data here. Again, 3 years data, you've got over 160,000 plus hits. And we just highlighted 4 crops. As you mentioned, we've got crop data on onions and alfalfa and pecans, I think were also listed in there. Wide cucumbers, my goodness, all kinds of things. So the key here is how can folks access this data? Who do they need to contact to learn more, to dig into the bigger picture, but really bring it home to their location?
Well, to me, the biggest value is getting these samples on your farm.
Okay.
To us, we like to look at the data holistically to see where are we missing things, and what are opportunities that our customers are maybe not paying attention to based off the data. But the most important thing is to know what's going on your farm.
Yep.
And what's showing up on your acres. Contact your local Helena representative. Ask about Extractor. We can get you on. We have programs where we go out multiple times during the year. We have some programs where we go to the same site throughout multiple growth stages and track it throughout the year. We can do a lot of different things, but that would be where I would start.
Wow, that's great advice. And Derek, definitely an evolving area. And what's really neat about all of this information is we're able to bring it together and really, discover challenges that we didn't even know existed.
Right. That's what I get excited about. I know, as an agronomist, certain things by crop are going to be issues, and the data tends to back that up. Yep. But what gets me excited is what can we learn? What are some of those missing links that we haven't historically thought were problems at all?
Right. Well, Derek Emerine, I want to thank you for coming into the FieldLink podcast today to join us, to share some deeper insight about data management from the Extractor program at Agri-Intelligence.
Sure. Glad to be here. Thank you.
And joining us now on FieldLink from Nashville is Jody Lawrence. Jody, welcome to FieldLink.
Thank you, Bill. It's good to be back.
Hey, Jody, we got a lot of things kind of happening in the grain markets right now, specifically not in grain, but on the energy side of things. Lots of movement happening there. Bring us up to speed.
Lots of movement. OPEC was just waiting in the weeds for a production cut, and I had referenced this all through the winter that they really are the final say-so in where energy prices go, or how they can be controlled at least. And they had crude oil about a week and a half ago dipped below $70 for the last time that they wanted to see it. They got a lot of cooperation in a private meeting in all the OPEC plus countries. Russia being one of the odd people that you would not expect to cut the production, but they volunteered to do it, as did Kuwait. Saudi Arabia is going to cut some, not sure how much, but that immediately spiked crude oil, and now we're trading over 84 or 80. $3 a barrel, and we were trading 66 less than a month ago. So it's up. Crude oil has jumped about 33%. Diesel has not jumped the equivalent, but it is up about 15% since that cut was announced, and you're trading on the June futures at about 265. So that's good news, because that's still well below $3, which everybody kind of figures is a pain threshold on the futures. But it does indicate that if OPEC gets their goal, which they always do, which is trying to keep crude between 90 and 95, that it will continue to drag diesel higher into the summer driving season. And then the spillover in all the energy comes into the ethanol markets, that it should help corn demand, because the ethanol grind margins are exceptional right now, the best they've been in several months. And then the bigger discussion on what happens with the renewable biodiesel, and as those plants open, what goes on in the biodiesel industry. So certainly $90 to $95 crude oil will have a positive effect for the margins in the ethanol and biodiesel and renewable fuel space.
Yeah, the renewable fuels space certainly getting set up to be some pretty good winners here and creating quite a lot of demand for some of these, both corn as well as soybeans, as we look across the nation for the biofuel market. Jody, let's talk a little bit about shift gears. Let's talk about the beef market. What's happening out there with them cattle producers?
Well, cattle market has been in really great shape. You had a new round of contract ties in the nearby futures contracts this month, or excuse me, this week, and you have cash prices in the high 170s being traded. The cattle market from the beginning of COVID and even before COVID has done an exceptional job, much better than most other industries, in managing their inventory. And they do have the luxury of a long cycle and how long it takes to have a calf before it gets on feed and gets to market. But what we have seen is that they have kept their numbers tight enough uh, to equal the demand and have uh, a very slow upward movement in both profitability and price, because even when the red flag came up that the COVID stimulus money was going to come out, that we may be in a recession and higher rates, the demand has not fallen off. And so that's why you see the cattle market in such good shape. And if you're in the cattle market, certainly I could see locking in some long-term feed needs, because with an unpredictable growing season ahead of us, December corn just doesn't look like it wants to go below 550. This would be a good spot if you are in the turning feeders into fats business and need to lock in those margins.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point. As we take a look at the overall consumer demand, we don't see that falling off for the beef industry. As you mentioned, COVID really kept the energy going. And even though average income is down, the American palate for beef is still there.
That really started back at COVID, because once everybody was at home and had the disposable income, and they realized how satisfying it was to be able to cook a steak as good or better, and certainly at a much lower price point than if you went out to a Ruth's Chris or to a really nice restaurant. That it's just something that you can't really even call having a high-end steak cut a luxury anymore. It might not be a necessity in some households, but certainly it is more part of the daily diet than it was 5 years ago. Certainly, you'd have to go back to pre-COVID to find when the demand was this good for the higher end cuts of beef.
You bet. Jody, WASDE, they came out with a report this week, and nothing earth shattering. How about a little update there?
A couple interesting numbers. The corn stocks were at 1.342 billion bushels, which was slightly above what the trade estimate was. The bean stocks were at 210, which was 12 million above. Wheat stocks were just a little bit higher at 598. But the interesting thing about all three of those, where we sit heading into another growing season, is that they are once again lower than they were in this report last year. And if we continue, and certainly last year's crop was a good crop, but below more than 5 bushels below trend, there wasn't enough to demand that we could, that these stocks were trimmed just a little bit. So it reminds us that in the big years, we certainly can outproduce demand and get the ending stocks up over what you would call comfortable levels, but just good to slightly below trend yield years. The world is still going to have a really hard time staying much ahead of what the demand is, because you look at all of the economic factors, from COVID to inflation to rising interest rates to the attempt at deflation, that you still are not seeing the great leaps ahead in either production to more than far more than demand. That demand slowly but surely keeps up with what we're able to produce. So I think, to me, out of all the numbers that I saw, the fact that we went through another growing season in the U.S. and had U.S. stocks trim slightly, that tells you that the ag industry is in a great position for the long term.
Yeah, it certainly starts to feel like that. There's still a lot of questions out there, obviously, with the economy, interest rates, and then even, some of the supply chain things. We're still not sure what's going to happen in Ukraine, if, the Russians are still going to continue, to extend that date that they talk about in the Black Sea or not. Will that disrupt some markets? Only time will tell, won't it?
Yeah, to me, looking forward, I'm thrilled that all the conversations, texts, and emails I've gotten from everybody that was getting out and getting a few fields planted this week. That's the best news of the week that I've seen. Although it's always, when you start talking about pre-April 15th planting, it's going to be bearish price, but that's fine. I'd rather everybody be in the field and have December corn take a 10-cent lick. But when you look at the big picture of the grain market, what Russia decides to do in the next month is going to be critical, because I don't think that the world wheat market would be quite as uncertain, as explosive as it was at the initial invasion back in February of last year, because they figured out some logistics in the middle of it, but it would cause an enormous disruption still. And wheat could easily put on $1, $1.50 if they shut down the corridor. That would pull corn along with it, 40 to 60 cents, I think, at a minimum. And then you look at the other things that come out of those ports. You have a lot of sunflower oil, edible oil, that comes through that would spill over into the bean and bean oil market. So May 18th and what Russia decides to do becomes really interesting. And the other hook in this is that is right at the start of Ukraine's winter wheat harvest season. So if they shut down the deal and shut down the ports, whether it was through military strike or just through the deal, ending the deal, and the insurers and the shippers of the world decide not to go back into the Black Sea, I wouldn't say the whole Ferris wheel would start all over again in the wheat market, but it would certainly start spinning a lot faster.
Yeah, and I think that that news there is really important for wheat producers to keep an eye on, as we take a look at our spring wheat as well as our winter wheat production here in the United States. Some of those winter wheat areas are, off a little bit based on some of the early reports here based on drought. But then you get further north in that spring wheat market, a lot of those folks are still under a big old blanket of snow. Hopefully, with some of these anticipated weather changes, that'll pick up. But a lot of questions still in that wheat market.
Absolutely. And, I referenced the start of planting in a lot of the central corn belt. Certainly the Delta in Nashville is beautiful and sunny and 80, and has been for several days. So I know that the South and the Delta are moving right along. And I talked to producers as far north as Nebraska, across to northern Indiana, northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, that are getting in the field this week. They're the haves, but you look at the northern corn belt, the Dakotas, Minnesota, and the Canadian border, where a lot of corn acreage expansion was expected. They're expecting another 2 to 12 inches of snow this weekend, and you added on to a significant snowpack record for this point in April, that you are going to have several different problems when it starts to melt. They want it to warm up, but it's going to have to melt. The ground's going to have to dry out. There's going to be localized flooding, and then that water works its way down. I can't remember when it was. Seems to me like it was about 10 years ago when the Missouri River got out of its banks so badly around the Omaha, from the South Dakota line all the way down to Kansas border, all along just called it the general Omaha area, where it got out so much that it took out several million acres. So I'm not totally discounting that harvest is going to be on time. The planting is going to be on time, because there's a lot of issues to be addressed up there. And if we were expecting them to expand corn acres in historically wheat areas, and they can't do it, then all of a sudden that questions the 91.5 to 92 million acres of corn. Do we go back to last year at 90 of corn and 88 of beans and prevent plant, add a couple million acres on that? Next thing you know, the situation I just talked about that the WASDE brought up, that we're doing good just to barely break even or fall, just a little bit behind demand, that cycle starts up again. So next 6 weeks, we're going to see an awful lot of things that could turn out to be complete duds and everything ends up fine, or just have really, really explosive type, situation develop. And we hadn't even talked about pollination weather, the transition from La Nina to El Nino, and any of that. So you just got some normal spring heading into Memorial Day from Easter to spring issues that present wild cards that are difficult for us to predict.
And Jody, tell us a little bit of what's happening in the financial world. What's happening with this dollar?
The dollar is really going through some interesting changes because it is in a defined downtrend now as the inflation numbers have begun to shrink. They're still higher than the Federal Reserve would like them to see, but the Federal Reserve, because of the banking situation with Silicon Valley Bank and the potential bank failures and the shaky situation that some of these regional banks may be in, we may be at the end of the rate tight, or much closer to the end of the rate tightening schedule than we had originally thought. And what that does, it has sent the dollar down almost 7% in the last 6 weeks. And a lower dollar is better for U.S. exports. And it also brings in an interesting fund investment, speculative investment trade, where a lower U.S. dollar makes commodities attractive, which certainly could add some spice to the summer markets if we get a good bullish story.
Jody, want to thank you for joining us here today on FieldLink. Look forward to catching up with you next round.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Everybody out there planting, please be safe.
And welcome back to FieldLink. I'm your host, Bill Smith, and today we're going to become more wheat-wise. Joining us from North Dakota is Justin Mack. Justin is a Helena Product Manager in North Dakota. Justin, welcome to FieldLink.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Bill. Appreciate it.
Hey, Justin, before we deep dive into learning more about wheat and becoming more wheat-wise, let's talk a little bit about you. Tell us where's home and where'd you grow up and what do you do at Helena?
So I live up in Minot, North Dakota, so pretty near Canada, and been with Helena now. This is 5 years. This week, I think, was my 5th anniversary. So be going into my 6th crop with Helena, and prior to that, I worked for a major manufacturer as a tech rep in the Dakotas. I grew up in North Dakota most of my life, kind of bounced around for a while when I was younger, then put roots down in north central North Dakota when I was starting school. My mom kind of laid down the law on that one and put us at home for a while. So been up here for almost 30 years now. So this is home to me, and wheat is a crop that we see a lot of in this part of the world.
Well, happy anniversary, Helena anniversary, that is, Justin, thanks for joining us today to become more wheat-wise. So let's dive into wheat. Tell us about the situation you're at in Minot right now, North Dakota. How's the wheat crop? What stage are you at? Where are you at in the whole process? Are you under snow still?
So we're in the grain bin stage is what I'd call it still. So the wheat's still sitting, waiting to go. Across my territory, I cover from the Canadian border down to the Nebraska line, the western 2/3 of the Dakotas and eastern Montana. And I just pulled up a snow report map this morning to see how bad it was still. It's went away quicker than I think any of us would have thought it went away. When we had some 70, 80 degree days and a wind, it shrank pretty fast, but now we're wet. We're still got snow where it was deep. So guys are out for a little bit still. And, typically, our first planting date for insurance is in March for the Dakotas. And we're middle of April here now. So everyone starts getting a little antsy, gets a little nervous. We still got some time, middle of May to late May is kind of our last planting date. So we still got a month, a little over a month in spots. But with equipment these days, it seems like we can get a lot in the ground really quick. We just got to manage how we do that.
Yeah, you're exactly right, and it is drying out a lot quicker than a lot of folks think, and it's going to definitely move fast. And we still got a lot of time, as you mentioned, for wheat producers in that part of the world to get a good crop in. So let's start talking a little bit about some fundamentals of becoming wheat wise. Seed treatments. A lot of growers, we talk about there's a lot of moisture there. We've got a lot of snow still in the ground. Boy, having that wheat seed protected on the front end in that spring wheat market is really very important to take consideration this year, correct?
Yeah, so I mean, cool wet springs, you can get a lot of the diseases sneaking in on those seedlings, and it just starts robbing yield early and up front. So you don't want to start the game behind the ball. And seed treatment's one of those things where when you're doing bin run seed is what we call it up in this part of the world, where we bring cleaner into the yard, have it cleaned out of our bin, put it on our truck. It can cause some issues because the farmer's trying to do it in a hurry. He's got a lot of things going on, and getting that seed treat on is one of those things where it's messy. It can be messy, I guess, is on an on-farm basis. It slows things down. So they want to throw it out right away. One of the first things they try to throw out. And if they can take the extra time to do it, I mean, it's worth the money every year to do it. It's crucial, in my opinion, just to keep that stand healthy and early, because you don't want to go back in and replant if you have issues, and you can't catch up if you did that. So seed treating is crucial. And, one thing I like to add into it is our kickstand product, kickstand PGR, just helps shoot it out of the ground so much quicker, gets you off and rolling quicker. So seed treating, don't forget about it. I mean, it's a necessary event or application to take place early in the spring here.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you bring up a really strong point there. When time gets a little tight, we say, okay, what can we cut back just to get that extra, few acres planted? But boy, taking a little extra time to ensure that you are getting that seed treated properly and taking some of those advantages on front end can really mean a lot of dollars on the back, can't it?
Yeah, I mean, typically seed treatment ROI is a lot greater than most other inputs you put into that crop. So it's one I hate seeing guys miss. And, surprisingly enough, there's a lot of guys who just skip that step altogether a lot of the time. And, I don't think they're realizing what they're giving up. And those extra bushels in the end of the day are a lot of profit that you can put back into your operation for, easier seed treat equipment or whatever equipment you may need on that farm that year.
Yeah, definitely. Earlier, Justin, we were talking about the importance of a good fertility plan, and that's true for every crop, and that's equally true for, spring wheat. What are some of your strategies as it relates to having a good plan from a fertility perspective?
Yeah, so, in my part of the world, we're predominantly dryland wheat, right? So we don't got a lot of options to put things on without making an extra pass across that field with that sprayer, that spreader. So I like to try to have, educate these guys and help them plan to take full advantage of every application. We look at how well irrigated guys do versus the dryland guys, and it's because they're given that crop nutrition throughout the year. Well, I want my guys, to try to manage to put nutrition on every time we're driving across the field. Don't leave an application naked, or don't leave it not providing that crop some nutrition if you can. So I like them to try to build a full year plan and then work with Mother Nature as she allows. So, I don't like the whole set it and forget it, the old Nuva wave, let's make a turkey or a chicken and set it on the counter and you're done, right? You just put all your nutrition down up front and you're done. Forget about it, go to the lake. Well, I mean, that works if you want low bushel yields, or, you don't want to push the envelope anymore. Or if you got the right soil type, it may work too. But if you can layer these applications in, get your starter fertilizer down up front, protect that with, some research, some humic acid to help keep that all available. Come back in crop with some Coron or some high phos, layer some of those other NP and K nutritions out throughout the year when that crop really needs it, when those demand curves start spiking. So I try to talk that whole season approach and plan that into the budget now instead of being reactive in season. It's always easier to take something away from the budget than it is to add to the budget as you're going throughout the cropping season. So I like to have that whole plan built, and as Mother Nature allows you to have that moisture to push that yield, keep those applications in. If she dries out in June, that's when you start backing things off. I also look at it as a little bit of an insurance policy on your fertilizer bill, right? Like if you have to do it 8 out of 10 years you're doing it, but the other 2 years you didn't, there's your premium back, there's your return. Or if you stick it all up front, you're kind of at Mother Nature's mercy to do that, especially if you got a good rotation where you got, a legume crop following a cereal grain. That cereal grain or that legume crop doesn't need all the nutrition that you may have put down for your cereal grain if you're carrying over a bunch of nitrogen. So it's a whole programmed approach and strategy that I think we need to continue to develop and push on more growers and help them understand how they can be more successful and manage their dollars and risk more appropriately.
Yeah, you bring up some excellent strategies there to have that plan up front financially as well as from a scientific standpoint. And you can certainly peel that back throughout the growing season based on what Mother Nature throws at us. But kind of just going in shooting from the hip can really cost growers a lot of dollars and a lot of bushels at the end of the day. Justin, let's move on and talk a little bit about, some other areas of being wheat wise as growers get ready for their spring crop. Let's talk about burn down. Burn down is one of the first activities a lot of growers in your country are going to be taking advantage of here pretty soon. What are some key strategies that you recommend?
Knowing what weeds you have out there is going to be important. There's some of them that we're just not controlling with the Roundup by itself or glyphosate by itself anymore. And knowing what you got to control is primarily my first focus. Second focus is knowing what your plant back restrictions are. Sometimes a few of those weeds might need something that we got to wait a few days to come back into. And then third focus is going to be make sure you know what kind of water you're using. And I say that, and most people might be listening and thinking, well, what's this guy talking about? Water's water, right? So I'd argue that's not the case. So last summer, I ran 137 samples across my territory and found out there's very diverse waters across the area, even within the same water sources. So, just because you have rural water doesn't mean you got great water. Or if you got city water doesn't mean you have great water. I stuck a pH meter in my own tap water here in North Dakota, and it was like 10.4 pH. So I'm going to need a lot more adjuvant in there, water conditioner, to help drop that to where I want it on certain products versus others. And then just knowing what's in the tank, right? So if you got an SU, you're going to want that SU, that pH for the SU to be active. You're going to want that closer to neutral or 7 versus if you got glyphosate and dicamba with some of them weak acid herbicides in there. You're going to want to drop that down to that 3.5, 4.5 range. And depending on the type of dicamba too, you got to watch out. You don't want to drop it too low. So there's a lot going on in that burn down application, especially when you got some of these hard control winter annuals. So being aware of your weed and your plant back rotations and your water is very crucial. And, some of the other things you think about is what does that herbicide need for, make that active ingredient work? Is it a surfactant for coverage and spreading, or is it an oil for penetration? Like the PPOs, like a sharpener and aim, a fire zone product is going to be awesome there. Where with glyphosate alone, if you're just running a Roundup product, that's more of a hellfire play. So, working with the retailer that you trust and making sure that you're getting good information is going to be crucial for that burn down application too. And the other thing on the burn down is don't get so far ahead planting that you can't get a burn down in. We don't want to come into crop or into the growing season with 3-4 inch weeds before the wheat's out of the ground. There's a lot of good weed control options for in crop, but we don't want to put any more selection pressure on the options that we have than we already do. So keep those weeds small by getting that burn down done. Sometimes you might have to shut the planter down for a few hours and jump in that sprayer, go catch up on some acres, just so that you're not leaving them not burnt down. That's something that we, as a growing population up, or grower population up here, have a hard time doing, is not just continuing to plant, but for the best interest of everything that we're doing, sometimes we just got to park the planter for a few hours and jump in that sprayer.
Justin, that's a lot of really, really good advice, and you're spot on with pause, breathe, and if you do need to get off that planter in order to get that effective burn down, there's so many things that can be impacted by taking advantage of that, that quick spray. Boy, especially in that part of the country, and you know it better than I do, but moisture's the king, and if you let those little weeds compete for moisture at this stage, it can impact you long term as well.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than when the kochia is robbing all your moisture and nutrition, and you have nothing you can do about it, because now it's 10 inches, 12 inches tall, and your wheat's 3, and you're waiting so you can get into that application window of when can I spray.
Justin, I also want to go back. You talked about something really, really important that I think a lot of producers kind of get caught in the moment and kind of forget. And especially in your country right now, it's a little bit of the lull before the storm, so to speak, before all heck breaks loose. Now's a great time to go get your water tested. To ensure, you mentioned it. You could have different sources throughout your whole operation. Don't just test what you got at home. Test all of those particular sources, correct?
Yeah, so I was, my father-in-law farmed, and we had this conversation a couple Easters ago, and we were sitting there, and I'm like, well, have you ever tested them? He goes, no. He goes, I just fill up wherever the truck's parked at. And I'm like, well, you should test them. Like, just see what it comes back at. One well was really high in iron, so high iron is not good for your dicambas. It ties up dicamba. So, in these spring burn downs, when guys are using lower rates of dicamba just so you can meet the plant back intervals, well, what's that iron doing to that dicamba? Like, it's making it inactive. So how much are we losing? You don't know. So, and then his rural water was, higher pH. So he needs a little more health iron there to drop that down to help his glyphosate out. So just, it can help you really dial in your adjuvant recommendations, and, help you make sure that, okay, just because the truck's parked over there doesn't mean I should fill up there today. Like, makes you make those educated decisions. So you're managing the dollars you're spending on the active ingredient. You're spending a lot of money on active ingredient right now. And if you can take an extra 20 minutes, or you can take, just that extra precaution to make sure everything you're doing is contributing to efficacy, don't make you the limiting factor out of the deal. So, yeah, testing your water now is a great thing to do. It doesn't take a lot. It's relatively costly. It doesn't cost a whole lot to get it done, especially with what it could cost you in the end.
Yeah, I think that's very wise advice, and based on talking to other agronomists about this topic, testing now is really important. Everybody should do it, especially if you're kind of in that waiting stage. Even if you're not, I mean, it takes 5 minutes to draw a water sample and get it tested. But as you get into season, you may want to retest it again, because as that water level or some of those sources change due to Mother Nature, water tables go up and down, things can change. Maybe not a lot, but boy, it's, again, very cheap insurance to ensure that you're getting, all of your investment out of that herbicide program that you're investing in.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as we've seen some drought conditions up here in the Northern Plains over the last couple of years. Our water qualities were definitely poorer than they have been in the past. And, with this moisture we've had this winter, hopefully that lightens that pressure of that water quality issue. But I mean, no matter what we're doing, there's always something that needs to be done to that water just to ensure that those active ingredients are doing what you're asking them to do. So, even if you've had great water or think you've had good water, there's probably something we still need to do to help make sure you're driving efficacy on those herbicides. And I mean, it's everything. It's insecticides and fungicides too. So you really got to watch out what you're doing with.
That's great wheat-wise advice there for any crop, right, Justin? Justin, as we get ready to plant 23, the spring wheat crop, what are some last parting advice that you could share with growers and our listeners?
Pay attention to those little things. I mean, I know it takes time, but that little bit of extra time you're going to spend here up front is going to help you in the long run. Make sure you got that seed treatment on that wheat seed. Make sure you got that burn down, and then plan that full season nutritional approach. If you're not doing that, I would challenge you to try to do that on a few acres at least, and see if you see the difference. Putting nitrogen and phos and potassium and micros on late is definitely something that we've seen at Helena, a positive response, positive ROI on all those applications. The other thing is, ergot, head scab. There's ways to help mitigate some of that, help manage some of that. If you're not looking at some of the nutritional programs for that and fungicides for, the head scab part, definitely something that you need to start building into your budget and taking advantage of the tools we have to help mitigate those risks as well.
Well, that's great advice, Justin. I want to thank you for joining us on this episode of FieldLink and helping us become more wheat wise.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of FieldLink. Be sure to subscribe to the FieldLink podcast wherever you get your podcast, or find us on YouTube so you don't miss an episode as we visit with growers, agronomists, and industry specialists about technology, markets, innovation, and the people working hard to keep agriculture the #1 industry in the nation.